We are just about 6 weeks away from the college football opener, and there are previews and prognostications and predictions flying all over the place in magazines and on television and on message boards. But let's go to the numbers and the projections that really count. Let's go to Vegas and Peter Loshak of Sportsbook Review to help us filter through what really counts, what the numbers are currently, and what might affect them going forward. Peter, thanks so much for joining us. Let's start this by getting a base for what Vegas thinks about the odds in each particular conference. I took a review of most of the major sites, and in the Big Ten, no surprise, Ohio State, generally a minus 175 to minus 300. And for those people that don't understand the betting process, if you see a plus next to the number, that means if you lay down a $100 bet, your return is going to be that number. So plus 240 means you're going to return a 240 net on a $100 bet. The minus is a little bit trickier to figure out, but it's basically going to be less than $100. So for Ohio State at minus 300, that's going to pay off roughly $35 on a $100 bet. Okay, we got TCU at minus 180 in the Big 12, Oregon minus 225 in the Pac-12, the SEC, Bama's the favorite at plus 250. Clemson, Florida State, pretty much a toss-up in the ACC right now, around 240. So I've always wanted to ask somebody this, Peter, when looking at the odds on any particular game in particular, if we're looking at games, I'm wondering if Vegas is actually making a projection. Let's say Ohio State's playing Michigan, Buckeyes a 7-point favorite. That's the opening line. Does Vegas believe that's most likely the outcome of the game? Or are they trying to estimate where the betting public is going to look at that game and trying to create 50-50 odds on each side and 50-50 betting on each side?
Well, first of all, game spreads are different from futures odds, but the answer is both, but more so the tendency of the betting action that they expect to receive. I mean, they have a very good, obviously, since they've been doing it, week in and week out, year in and year out, they have a very good sense of what kind of action they're going to get, both from the betting public and from the sharp guys, and that's obviously a huge factor as well. So it's not just the betting public; it's also the sharp action that they know that they'll get depending on what they do. But they're mostly trying to balance action, and then there's also an eye towards the way that the game's going to turn out. But it's mostly to balance action.
Okay, Peter. So looking at the previews and predictions, they're all over the place. Obviously, some people are more respected than others. Some are crunching numbers. Some are just making guesses and estimations, but still have some weight in terms of the college football world and the fans, but maybe not necessarily Vegas. So is Vegas swayed by any one particular person's previews and predictions?
I wouldn't say that they're swayed by any individual preview or prediction, but they are, they will, the leans that they have on the lines that they set are influenced by the same kind of hype that they know the public is also going to be swayed by. So it's not they're not directly swayed by previews and predictions, but indirectly they absolutely are, because they know that the public's going to be swayed that way. So they definitely have an eye towards general, hype. Like Alabama is always going to be a team that the public is going to, is going to prefer to bet. And Alabama is also a team that tends to get, a lot of hype from the analysts.
Okay, so once I release my predictions, I can't necessarily expect Vegas just to go crazy.
No, right. but you will be part of the general hype pool that does have an indirect impact. Absolutely.
Very good, Peter. Let's look at the Big Ten first. Okay. And of course, this quarterback competition is something that everybody is waiting to see the outcome. And the winner is generally considered one of the top 3 or 4 quarterbacks in the country. So how much is this competition between Braxton Miller, JT Barrett, and Cardell Jones going to factor into the odds of Ohio State winning the Big Ten championship?
I don't think the competition itself factors in that much, but the depth absolutely does. I mean, one of the big, probably the biggest factor aside from on-field talent when it comes to a futures odds is depth, and injuries is the biggest unpredictable factor when it comes to college football. And, so the fact that that Ohio State will be able to weather injuries to any of those guys and still have a premier quarterback on the field is definitely a huge factor in the reason that they're such a big favorite to win the Big Ten. But who wins the actual competition itself doesn't matter that much at all.
Yeah, it seems like Tom Brady, Peyton Manning, somebody like that goes down in the NFL, and that affects a point spread like nothing else from an
Oh, it
injury
absolutely does.
standpoint.
And if there's a premier quarterback that goes down and it's a big drop off to the backup in college football, that's even more of a factor than in the NFL. Absolutely. So the fact that there's depth, such amazing depth for Ohio State, is one of the big reasons why they're such a huge favorite.
Very good. And it appears as though you have to be like a great player at another position to affect the point spread much.
Yes, in college. Yes, yes.
Okay, let's look at the Heisman race coming off the Ohio State topic, because we got Trevon Boykin right now of TCU and Ezekiel Elliott, ironically, the Ohio State running back, leading the Heisman odds at this point with a clear decided advantage over Dak Prescott in the field.
Yes.
The Ohio State quarterback who wins this competition as soon as it's announced, fill in the blank, wins the Buckeye starting QB job. How much are they going to factor into the Heisman race suddenly?
Well, yeah, it's interesting because for the prop bets that I'm seeing to win the Heisman, yeah, Boykin is the favorite at plus 775 that I'm seeing. But Ohio State player, that prop is actually a plus 560. So it appears that Vegas is just putting up a prop for Ohio State in general, as opposed to the obvious marquee star on the team. So if you want to bet one of the quarterbacks for Ohio State's going to win the Heisman, it's probably best just to take Ohio State player on the yes at plus 560, which is the odds that I'm seeing right now.
Okay, one more from the Big Ten. I noticed Penn State and Michigan making that comparison. The Nittany Lions coming off a season in which they won 2 more games than Penn State, beat a decent team in the bowl game, have a hot young coach in James Franklin, have a quarterback who's considered to be bouncing back, one of the best in the nation in Christian Hackenberg, better talent overall, better recruiting classes in recent years, versus a Michigan team, obviously, that just hires Jim Harbaugh and has that hope, and the odds of winning the Big Ten are almost identical.
Yes, the odds of winning the Big Ten are almost identical. You're right, but the season win totals are actually not. Penn State actually has a pretty solid advantage right now. I'm seeing Penn State, the season win total is 8, the over is minus 145, and Michigan's just 7.5 minus 105. So that's more than a half game in favor of Penn State. So that's a pretty significant discrepancy there. So yeah, the odds are not necessarily always perfectly in line. It's true to win the Big Ten. The odds are almost identical, but clearly the market is favoring Penn State on their season win total right now. And I think that's, justified.
Yeah, I think Penn State also has a much easier non-conference schedule that factors into that as well. In the ACC, Everett Golson moves from Notre Dame to Florida State. Any factor in there, losing Jameis Winston, but gaining Everett Golson as an FSU quarterback in the Seminoles odds?
No, it takes a lot to move these odds, especially early futures odds, early in the off season, and the odds just don't change that much when someone like Golson gets acquired. I mean, the other guy, McGuire, was probably going to be, okay. There's a lot of, uncertainties with Golson as well. So, he doesn't have that much of an impact that, as soon as, the announcement that he's going to Florida State, all of a sudden the market reacts. It doesn't really work that way.
Yeah, I mentioned great players. I'm going to fall short of calling Dalvin Cook a great player, but an emerging star at Florida State. He's suspended. Did that factor any into Florida State's odds?
Not that I saw. I didn't see. Before the suspension, they were plus 250 to win the ACC, and after I checked the odds, plus 250 where I was seeing them. So it's a suspension like that. It's important. They might take. Someone might act on it, but in general, there's not some like sharp guy who's gonna see a suspension like that and then just immediately go and bet one way or the other. It's just they're not gonna act on that kind of information.
Gotcha. The talent pool pretty deep at Florida State. Yeah. Peter Loshak joining us from Sportsbook Review. Peter, gonna throw you a bit of a curveball just because in the Big 12 you got TCU and Baylor. Just the question about name schools, meaning that Texas and Oklahoma down to varying degrees. Does the betting public and does Vegas sway anything based on name recognition, meaning that the casual bettor out there may be attracted by Notre Dame, Ohio State, Oklahoma, Texas, even if they're down?
Yeah, absolutely. There's those big name teams are always going to attract public betting action, even in down years. That's definitely something that that Vegas factors in, both in terms of futures and in terms of game by game betting. It's something that they factor in more in terms of individual game spreads, because the casual fan doesn't have as big of an impact on futures odds line movements. It's mostly sharp guys like last year. Sharps piled in on TCU, and that was very telling. But yeah, absolutely, the big name teams, even in down years, attract a lot of betting action, and that's absolutely something that that Vegas is aware of and factors in for sure.
Yeah, the Pac-12 has been very balanced in recent years, maybe aside from Oregon and Stanford to a lesser degree. Oregon losing at quarterback, other key players maybe drawing back to the pack. At least that's the perception. This league could produce a ton of 9-3 teams,
Yes.
possibly. Does that hurt the Pac-12 in a projection for the college football playoff?
That's something that people love to debate. In my sense, for any individual team, it might hurt an individual team. In other words, an individual team might say, "Oh, if we had been in the the Mountain West this year, we would have been a lock for the playoffs." That's something that you can debate. As far as the conference as a whole, I don't think so. I think that for all intents and purposes, the Pac-12 champ will get into the playoffs. But it's certainly debatable.
Yeah, in the SEC, everything seems to line up as most would expect based on last year's results and losses from last season. But Auburn losing 5 games last year seems to be a very hot pick for the college football playoff, despite losing its main quarterback, wide receiver, running back. Again, in a very difficult league, still very close to playoff contention, according to Vegas. Is that based, again, on outside prognostications, or is that strictly crunching numbers?
Oh, well, both. I mean, they crunch numbers, but in college football, it's not as easy to crunch numbers with smaller sample sizes and with college players. There's so much replacement. But I mean, the top teams every year, Alabama loses a ton of talent, but they replace it with the same amount of talent. And Auburn's kind of the same year. There's a reason Auburn has such high expectations this year. I mean, that quarterback is expected to be possibly as good as Cam Newton. Their receiver might be their top receiver might be the number 1 receiver in the draft. Then Muschamp coming in as the defensive coordinator. So it's there's reason for it, and if all the question marks with Auburn live up to expectations, they absolutely will be one of the top 5 teams in the country. So yeah, all those losses they matter, but the numbers but these futures odds, there's a lot of guesswork, and sort of the odds makers know that when it comes to futures odds, the lines are a lot softer than the individual game spreads. So you could make a good argument that Auburn shouldn't be ranked in the top 5 on the odds, and you might be right, but there's good reason for them being so right now.
Do those individual numbers, and again, if I'm throwing you a wild card,
no, sure.
Do those individual numbers in terms of the over and under on the wins include potential conference championship games?
Oh yeah, of course, absolutely.
Okay. Outside of injury, we talked about injury. We talked about suspension in the case of Dalvin Cook. Any other events that could possibly really sway a line in terms of the futures before we get to game 1?
Well, big betting action, the sharp betting action. That's not necessarily an event, but like for instance last year again, the sharps piled in on TCU futures, and that definitely moved those odds. As far as an event, it's basically just injuries or suspensions. But as far as what'll move the line, if Billy Walters or some of the big futures bettors come in and pound away at the futures odds for one team or another, that'll definitely move those odds significantly by week 1 for sure.
I'm personally not big into these prop bets, but people love them. Are there any particular ones that you find interesting, or the public's finding interesting at this point?
Not really. It's just Heisman is the main prop bet, and that's about it.
Okay, Peter, before I let you go, what kind of traffic are we expecting in week 1? Do you have any kind of gauge on that based on what we've seen in the past? And what are some of the big number games or weeks or times of year?
I'm sorry, your question is
just in terms of the traffic that Vegas is going to see for the opening week of college football.
Well, yeah, it's always a little bit hard to figure out which games the public is going to be really attracted to, and a lot of times they do tend to be, like Oregon or one of the marquee teams playing like a lesser team. It's not necessarily, the big matchups like Arizona State against Texas A&M. Obviously, that's going to be a heavily bet game. That's not necessarily going to be the highest bet game. It could wind up being TCU at Minnesota. It could wind up being the public falls in love with TCU and comes in all over them, and then the line gets too inflated, and then the sharps come way in on Minnesota, and then the public bets on TCU more. So, but obviously, the big name teams in week one are going to attract the most action, and it's probably going to be one of those games. It might not necessarily be, Wisconsin, Alabama, although it certainly could be. That's definitely going to be guaranteed to be a big action game. Not necessarily the top action game, though.
Peter Loshak from Sportsbook Review joining us. Peter, thanks so much for the information and the insight. This stuff is fascinating.
Thank you for having me anytime.